I'd like to now introduce Dr. John Minns, who's an active member of the Refugee Action Committee. Dr. John Minns.
Friends, the policies which we come here today to protest were born of political opportunism. They were nurtured by some of the most base, vile and xenophobic sentiments of which the country is possible. They exist today in international infamy, and they will be remembered only with utter shame. For how many years now have we seen Prime Minister and Shadow, have we seen Immigration Minister and the Shadow Immigration Minister locked in a kind of macabre dance, shadowing each other's steps in an attempt to prove to us that each is tougher on asylum seekers than the other? But it's not the toughness of courage, it's not the toughness of moral fibre, it's the toughness of the schoolyard bully. It's the toughness of the bully whose position is based on demeaning and harming the most defenceless and the most vulnerable. I know something about this. I remember at school, I remember a kid I knew who was bullied. And I remember thinking in later years, I should have done more to stop that. I didn't do it, but I should have stood with him against it, much more. And it still gives me a sense of shame that I didn't. 2 years after we left school, I was a pallbearer at his coffin after his suicide. But today, we will stand with the vulnerable and the defenceless against the bullies of the government and the opposition. There are so many big things wrong with these policies, it's hard to know where to begin. As far as I know, we are the only country in the world both to manufacture cruelty deliberately towards these asylum seekers and then to outsource it to poor third world countries. The big things. Every new bit of information that comes out of Manus Island and Nauru and the detention centres in Australia, every new piece of information that comes out from Amnesty, from the UNHCR, from whistleblowers and from the asylum seekers themselves tells of new horrors. And therefore, it is not surprising that the official policy is silence and secrecy. We are now a country that says to asylum seekers, we don't care what the validity of your claims really is. We don't care what horrors you might face if you are forced to go back to your homelands. We don't care whether you are genuine refugees or not. You will never call Australia home. And General Angus Campbell has just made a video saying exactly that. The big things. We've taken now a generation of people who are already traumatised by their experiences in their own countries. We've taken people who've seen far too much of armed guards and barbed wire, and we guard them behind barbed wire, and we traumatise them further. And then there are what appear to be almost, compared to those things, the small things, but so significant. The verbal abuse of the asylum seeker that has now become almost the background noise of Australian politics. Illegal, illegal, illegal. Abbott, Morrison say it again and again. Morrison has decreed that his department must use the term illegal constantly, but it doesn't matter how many times they say it, it doesn't make it so. How do we know that? Because if I do something illegal, if I break the law, then I would expect to be charged, to be brought before the courts, to have my day in court, and if found guilty, to be given a sentence with a definable end. These people are not charged. They've broken no law. They cannot be charged, neither in national law nor in international law. They are in detention not because of any process, fair process of the courts. They're there because of the decree of the Minister of Immigration. The small things. There are thousands of stories coming out of the detention centres now, in part because many of the people there feel they have nothing left to lose. And so lots of information is coming to refugee advocates around the country. Here's one small example which I'll share with you, which it doesn't get publicity, but think about what this means for what we're doing. In Manus Island, one side faces the sea, and there's a walkway on the seafront, behind the wire of course, where the detainees have to walk in order to get to their meals, to eat meals 3 times a day. All this raw sewage from the camp passes through a rivulet under that walkway directly into the sea. And when there's a high tide or there's a storm, it covers the walkway, which they then have to walk through to eat. In the only footwear that they're provided, rubber thongs. These appear to be small things, but there are thousands and thousands of stories like that in centres controlled by our country, paid for by our tax dollars. And why do we do this? For what is this? Does it make us wealthier? That we spend billions of dollars now keeping a tiny number of people out, when we know that processing people's claims in the community, as we used to do, costs a fraction of that, less than 1/10 of the detention centres that exist now. Does it make our jobs any more secure? We know, of course, that the numbers of asylum seekers is tiny, both compared to the Australian population and even compared to the immigration intake of about 250,000 in the last financial year. So no, it doesn't imperil our jobs at all. And for those of us who live in this city, I think if we're worried about our jobs, the source of that concern is a little closer to home than Manus Island or Nauru. Does it make us any more secure from terrorist threats? For nearly 10 years, not one single security assessment was negative against people coming by boat. For nearly 10 years. Now there have been a few very dodgy assessments at that. But of course, it's simple common sense to think that if a terrorist organisation wanted to come here and to do us harm, would they choose the means of transport as a leaky boat? See, the fears that have been created in the Australian community are manufactured. They are fiction. They are as ludicrous as the Liberal candidate for the Western Sydney seat who said that the refugees were responsible for traffic jams on the M4. As ludicrous as that. But the suffering that those fears have caused is very real. It is fact. We stand here today to say no to all of that, to stop the process of demonising people whose only error was to think that this was a country which, after all of their troubles, might at last provide them with refuge. And so we must protest. We must fight. We have the major parties against us. We have most of the press against us. If we believe the polls, we have most of the community against us. But I've said this before, and I think it's absolutely true. We may be a minority, but we are a stubborn minority that for decades now has resisted the arguments of the major parties and the press, and we are still here. And we are a passionate minority that is more than capable of building this into a powerful mass movement, and that now is our task. To raise our voices, to rail against these injustices, not to meekly accept that this is what Australians will always think, and that political and realism and electoral success requires. We're not going away. And if for a future for the asylum seekers and a future for our country as well, if for that future we have to pay the price of some time and some effort building that movement, then it is indeed a very small price to pay. The great movements of equality for women, for workers' rights, for civil liberties, for Aboriginal rights, for against White Australia, all of those great movements which in so many important ways have shaped the decency that we have in this country, have created a good deal of that decency, is because of people giving up their time and their talents, using every resource of their arms and their brain to build such movements, and we need to do it again with this one. In the future, I think our movement will stand with those, and people will look back on this movement and be proud to be a part of it. As with all of them, there'll be people who'll exaggerate their role, say they were there when they weren't, and we will boast of being a part of it, as indeed we should. Because today we ask you to join that movement, to participate in that movement, to march with us, and with us side by side, for fairness, for justice, and for common humanity. We will win.
Thanks, Dr. John Means.